The Valdres Combat Academy had stood for 300 years. In that time, it had trained soldiers, tacticians, war priests, and weapons masters from 19 different species across the Outer Confederacy. It had produced 8 fleet commanders, 31 decorated battle strategists, and one sitting high chancellor who still kept her sparring calluses and wore them like a second set of credentials. Its graduation rate hovered at 31%. Its dropout rate was considered, by the Academy's own admissions board, a feature rather than a flaw. It had never, in 300 years, admitted a human. Soraya had changed that 14 months ago. She had not changed it easily. The application process had taken 8 months. Not because the paperwork was complex, though it was, but because the admissions board had voted against her 3 separate times, and she had appealed 3 separate times with the specific, documented, calmly worded persistence of someone who had decided to treat bureaucratic rejection the way water treats stone. Kalen had been on the 3rd appeals panel. He was the Academy's senior combat instructor, Valdres-born, 7 feet of layered muscle and disciplined stillness, with the gray-streaked mane of a veteran and the eyes of someone who had watched enough candidates break to know the difference between those who wouldn't and those who simply hadn't yet. He had read her file twice before the hearing. She had listed her combat training: 12 years of something called wrestling, 8 years of boxing, 4 years of judo, 3 years of Krav Maga. The names meant nothing in direct translation, but the underlying concepts: weight management, joint manipulation, impact absorption, and redirection were familiar enough to any serious tactician. She had also listed 2 years of competitive shooting, which the panel's weapons specialist had noted was technically relevant, and something called rock climbing, which none of them had known what to do with. She was 26 years old. She stood 5 feet 6 inches. She weighed, by Valdres measure, approximately nothing. The first 2 panels had seen a liability. Kalen had seen something else. He had voted to admit her. He had been, on both previous panels, the single dissenting vote. On the 3rd panel, he had arrived with a prepared statement that was 4 pages long and cited 12 separate precedents in the Academy's own charter regarding the definition of combat potential and its deliberate non-restriction to species-normative physical metrics. The board had admitted her, narrowly, with a probationary notation and a private consensus that she would wash out before the 1st month ended. She had not washed out. The combat trial was held at the end of the 14th month. Every candidate who reached it had already survived the academic curriculum, the endurance rotations, the weapons qualifications, and the squad tactical assessments. The trial itself was the Academy's final and most subjective evaluation, a live scenario, unscripted, against opponents the candidate did not choose and could not prepare for specifically. The parameters were simple. The candidate entered the assessment floor. The assessment floor was a large, climate-controlled space with variable terrain features, elevated platforms, narrow corridors, open ground, low obstacles. The candidate was told nothing about the scenario in advance. The candidate was evaluated on decision-making, adaptability, threat assessment, and combat effectiveness. What the parameters did not specify, and what every candidate learned through rumor and the careful silence of seniors who had already passed, was that the opponents were the instructors themselves. Kalen ran the trial personally. He stood at the observation window above the assessment floor with the 2 other senior instructors, Dras and Velith, watching Soraya enter below. She wore the standard candidate uniform: light armor, no weapons, same as every candidate. And she moved the way she always moved, which was quietly and with a particular quality of attention that Kalen had spent 14 months trying to name accurately. It was not alertness, exactly. Alertness implied waiting for something to happen. This was more like readiness that didn't announce itself. "She knows it's us," Dras said. He was the Academy's close-quarters specialist, broad even by Valdres standards, with 3 decades of assessment floors behind him. "They always know by this point. Knowing doesn't help most of them," Velith said. Kalen said nothing. Below, Soraya stopped in the center of the floor. She stood still for a moment, not frozen, not hesitating, but in the deliberate stillness of someone taking inventory. She turned in a slow, complete circle. Then she looked up, directly at the observation window, which was mirrored from below and invisible to any candidate who hadn't specifically learned its location. She couldn't see them. She looked at the window for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked away. She knows where we are, Kalen said. Drass was already moving toward the floor entrance. The scenario that followed lasted 11 minutes. Kalen reviewed the recording afterward for separate times. He had reviewed many trial recordings over the years. He had a methodical practice of it, cataloging technique and decision patterns for his own instruction files. He had never reviewed one 4 times in a single evening. The first engagement was Drass. He entered from the northern corridor at speed, in the low charging posture that was his signature opening and that had ended the confidence of more candidates than Kalen could count. Soraya did not move away from him. She moved toward him and to the left, inside his reach line before the reach could establish itself, and did something fast and geometric with her right arm and her hip and her body weight that Kalen had to slow the recording to quarter speed to fully parse. Drass went down, not stumbling, not off balance, down, the floor decisively. The recording's audio captured the sound of Drass's very genuine surprise, which was an extremely rare sound, and then the sound of Soraya already moving, because she had not waited to see if he stayed down. She had assessed, mid-technique, that he would, and she had already redirected. Velith came from the east platform. Velith was the Academy's highest-rated aerial combatant, a specialist in attacks from elevation that used momentum and mass to simply overwhelm the target's structural tolerance. Against another Valdris, this was frequently decisive. Against Soraya, Kalen watched it 3 times from 3 different camera angles. It was an education in what happened when mass and momentum met a person who had spent 8 years learning how to make other people's mass and momentum work against them. She didn't stop it. She redirected it, used the angle, contributed exactly enough force at exactly the right moment, and Velith's controlled descent became something less controlled, and the resolution involved the padded floor stopping Velith rather than Velith's plan reaching its conclusion. Velith also stayed down, not unconscious, not injured, but still. Kalen came last. He had stayed at the entrance corridor, watching the first 2 engagements complete, because he was the senior instructor and the trial protocol put the senior instructor last, and also because he had spent 14 months watching Soraya train, and he had wanted to see the first 2 engagements before he committed to an approach. He had watched them. He still wasn't certain. He entered from the west. She was already turned toward him. They looked at each other across 30 feet of assessment floor for a moment that the recording clock measured as 4 seconds, and that felt, to Kalen, considerably longer. He saw the same thing he had always seen in her face during training. Not aggression, not bravado, not the effortful focus of someone working hard to project capability. Just that quality he had never quite named. The readiness that didn't announce itself. He moved. What followed, the recording documented in full. Kalen did not need to review it multiple times because he had been present for it, and the sensory data was already cataloged in his body in the way that only direct experience catalogs things. He was faster than Drass. He was more technically varied than Velith. He had 31 years of assessment floors, and he did not have a signature opening, precisely because he had learned that signatures were gifts to prepared opponents. None of it was sufficient. It took her 4 minutes. 4 minutes against an opponent with 31 years and 7 feet, and all the weight behind it that physics required. She did not overpower him. She never tried to overpower him. She found every angle he didn't defend, redirected everything he committed, and was patient in the specific way of someone who understood that patience is just waiting for the math to resolve. He went down. He stayed down, not from injury, from the clear and fully conscious recognition that the position she had put him in admitted no productive continuation. The assessment floor was silent. From the entrance corridor, 2 junior evaluators had watched the final 3 minutes with tablets raised to record their assessments. They looked at each other. They looked at the floor, where all 3 senior instructors remained still. They looked at Soraya, who had stepped back to a neutral position, breathing elevated but controlled, hands open and at her sides. One of the evaluators, new, 2nd year on the assessment rotation, still carrying the reflexive assumption that the protocol outcome was predetermined, said, with genuine uncertainty, "Candidate Soraya, the panel's preliminary assessment is." He stopped. He looked at his tablet. He looked at the floor. He looked at Kalen, who had rolled to a sitting position and was looking at Soraya with an expression that the young evaluator had never seen on a senior instructor's face and couldn't immediately name. It was though the evaluator would take several days to land on the word satisfaction. The candidate, Kalen said, from the floor, in a voice entirely without surprise, has passed. Soraya exhaled once, slowly. She did not smile. She nodded, a small, precise acknowledgement, the gesture of someone receiving information they had already expected but were glad to have confirmed. Then she reached down and offered Kalen her hand. He looked at it for a moment. Then he took it, and the 300-year-old academy added a new notation to its records. Not a warning, not a disclaimer, not a probationary asterisk, just a name and a score and a date. The highest trial score in 31 years.